Okay, so this is the mechanical basis hypothesis. I know you guys have all heard of it. I'll just kind of do it the way I presented it at Ron's meeting. So the idea here is that brainstem, the symptoms of ME/CFS are essentially consistent with brainstem pathology, because if you see all these systems here, all of them are governed by the brainstem, and all of them are dysregulated in ME/CFS. So we looked at this study. It was the first of its kind. It was looking at the prevalence of mechanical pathologies in severe ME/CFS patients. So see these 83 and 80% numbers here. This study, I'll first set the background for it. There were 205 participants. It was retrospective cross-sectional study. It was performed at a specialist clinic, and everybody referred there had severe ME by the Canadian census criteria. And so what we see here is 83% of these patients had intracranial hypertension, signs of it, and 80% of them had craniocervical obstructions. And interestingly, these might actually be underestimates, because the 83%, this intracranial hypertension was measured non-invasively. And there are invasive measures of it that are more sensitive than those that were used in this study. And the 80% craniocervical obstructions, it's the same thing. They used MRIs, and there are more sensitive ways of measuring that. Also, they didn't really define craniocervical obstructions. So I'm assuming it was sort of, if they meant craniocervical instability, which seems probable, then they did not measure it in the most sensitive way. There are more sensitive ways of measuring that. So from here, at least like sort of from a molecular standpoint, we have, there's some research on ME/CFS, right? There's way too little given the symptom burden, but we do have some research. So one way to sort of incorporate this mechanical model into thinking, like within the broader research community, is to sort of look at the findings of any research study and sort of think backwards. Okay, could this be potentially regulated by the brainstem? Could this relate to the brainstem? And so just one example of that is there's this recent study called the multiomics of gut microbiome host interactions in long COVID and ME patients. And sort of the conclusion was that there were functional mechanisms underlying disease onset, and that was reduced microbial booty rate. And so, the brainstem regulates the GI system, the vagus nerve, and so basically you could look, okay, and they were saying, well, we don't know why. Of course, it's an important resource, this type of measuring we did to facilitate hypotheses, but that, there wasn't sort of a, perhaps this would relate to brainstem deformation or a mechanical model, right? So there are ways of thinking about research and interpreting results that could potentially be consistent with the mechanical model. And it may be helpful to think of results within those terms, or at least to sort of interrogate that. And I think that was it.
How about a few different questions right now? Maybe start with like, who has been evaluated for any of these mechanical conditions? If I can figure out how.
1, 2, 4. Well,
I see Isabel, thumbs up. Kat, thumbs up.
6 out of, how many do we have? Let's see.
19 people here.
Okay, yeah. So a little bit less.
I just hadn't been able to get my little hands up thing to go, so I was just
okay.
I mean, I think there's probably some of us that are probably that. That's why I went on camera. I was like, yeah, here we go.
Okay, yeah. I guess the next one I'd be curious is people to raise their hand if you suspect you have one of these conditions, but you just haven't been able to get evaluated for it yet. Or, okay, so raise hands if either you have been evaluated or you suspect and you haven't yet.
I raised my hand even though I'm not an ME/CFSer, because I just recently learned that I had inflated optic nerves when I went to the optometrist. And so I'm wondering if that might have something to do with my chronic migraines. So this is interesting even outside of the post-viral illness world.
That is interesting.
Yeah, it was a very it was an easy test. You know, you just look into something and they shine a green light on your eyes. So it, you know, seems very accessible,
Yeah,
way more accessible than a spinal tap.
that was the
Nice.
one that was used in the study, actually. It's optic nerve sheath diameter. That's like, yeah. So, and the migraines seem to go along with that a lot.
Thought of another question. So if everyone could put down their hands, and then my question is, are you hypermobile, or do you think you have a connective tissue disorder? So more
Okay.
than half again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because some of us with mechanical conditions, and this includes myself, I'm not hypermobile, except for my craniocervical junction was hypermobile. So it's like hypermobility is not a perfect measurement of EDS, or not a perfect, the EDS criteria is just kind of terrible. It was developed to be a population screener. It was developed in the 50s. It was designed to measure hypermobility on a population-wide scale from non-experts. So they chose the 9 joints that were the easiest to measure, the most convenient. It wasn't meant to be medical. And then it's just sort of been adopted in this way.
Yeah. So underestimate then here, you know, for people that raise their hands who are hypermobile, or, you know, think that have a connective tissue disorder. So there might be a lot more who don't, like you.
Yeah, that's like for myself, I'm only a little bit hypermobile and I score fairly low on the test. My kids score exceptionally high, of course, but my joints are unstable. And so even a hand surgeon, he could actually, even though I don't have any of the bendy joints, he was actually able to, he was like, yeah, everything on here is just, your joints are very unstable. So you'll be prone to injury and tear, but you're not like flexible as much as everybody else. I've got a couple of joints that are flexible, but not very many. So I think that's also something that a lot of us might have, is this instability that's not exactly not exactly a hypermobility, but we still have some of the genetic markers that you might see it in other parts of your family. It's like, oh no, I'm not flexible. I mean, look at my sister, look at what she can do, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that's also should be like kind of a red flag, is like, well, do you have extraordinarily flexible people in your family? Because if so, you may have issues with connective tissues that are not as obvious. It might just be a different aspect that comes up.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think inflexibility is a clue too. My family would have contests of who could touch their knees, not their toes. We couldn't get further than that.
Same. And you know, that's interesting because that's sort of a known sign of tethered cord. I mean, obviously it doesn't necessarily mean you have tethered cord, but that's something that often goes along with it. And
Yeah, I can do yoga pose, right? The yoga child pose. That's the no-no for tethered cord, but I can't touch my toes. So
Yeah.
weird mix.
Yeah. Jeff, is there any other questions that you would want to ask the group here?
Yeah, so what's your general impression of sort of the mechanical concept within the community in your sense? And I know you guys are members of different communities. So within the community you are in, what sort of the flavor of people's like perceptions of it? How does that go?
I think most people are overwhelmed, don't know where to start. And so if you try to talk to them, they shut down pretty quickly. Like, oh, I just can't deal with it. That's hard. And I don't want neurosurgery, so I don't want it to be true. So I'm going to ignore it for now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that too. I think in general though, a lot of people are like think that it's important and recognize it, you know, compared to a few years ago where you had to deal with a lot of stuff, Jeff.
Yeah. Yeah, things are progressing. It's at first there was a lot of hostility. And I think now it's sort of less hostile, but there's still so much fear. Do you think I think if there were non-invasive ways of addressing these things, I think this would be so easy. I think it would just be a different world. Is access to neurosurgeons or neurosurgery kind of a problem? Oh, there's a lot of hands up. Are those
Questions?
Yeah, question.
Okay, so some of you have probably seen this before. If you're on the data team, obviously you've seen this a bunch. And if you follow the Renegade Research or Remission Biome on Twitter, I think it's really important to share this in the R50 meeting because this is your data. You know, I got bearables from 27 participants who have been diligently recording their symptoms, their energy, their emotional state, their medications or supplements, 3 times a day, every day for months on end. And I aggregated all of this data into a master data set that is designed to tell us about sort of the structure of symptoms in ME/CFS and long COVID. And so we had 27 participants, and if you just count all of the person days, it's about 9,000 person days, which is what, 10 years, give or take. And then we had 3,000 unique symptoms spread out between everybody. And so what I did was I first filtered the data to only get those symptoms that appear in, I think it was 5 or more individuals. So if you had something super specific and super unique, I'm afraid that that symptom will not appear in the master matrix, but it will be in your personalized matrix. And so every row is a symptom. Like for instance, the top row here is irritability. Every column is also a symptom. So, this back column here is sore throat. And then the cells are colored so that if a cell is red, these two symptoms are more likely to co-occur together than you would expect by chance. So here we look and we can see that anxiety and irritability are, perhaps unsurprisingly, colored red. That means that on a given day, if you are anxious, you are more likely to also be irritable than you would expect just by random chance. And then symptoms are colored blue if they're actually less likely to appear together than you would expect by chance. So for instance, if you have jaw pain, then you are less likely to have hives on that same day than you would expect by chance. And so I took this matrix and I did what's called a clustering analysis. So I tried to find collections of symptoms that have co-occurred together more frequently than you would expect by chance, and more frequently than with other symptoms. And so this is what these squares are along the diagonal. These are symptoms that are sort of form a coherent unit. If one of these symptoms appears, all the other symptoms are more likely to appear as well. And we can kind of start to think about, well, what are these? I suspect that these reflect sort of underlying root causes. We've got maybe 5 different underlying systems that can be deranged in different ways and are semi-independent of each other. So for instance, this cluster here, third one to the right is going to be low appetite, flatulence, abdominal pain, diarrhea, nausea, and bloating. That could be SIBO or some kind of microbiome related dysfunction. The first cluster in the top left is going to be irritability, action paralysis, anxiety, sensory overload, low motivation, and blurred vision. This looks to me like something involving the brain or the central nervous system, possibly something related to glutamate. Kat can chime in on that, or neuroinflammation. And so the hope is that by digging into these and incorporating more data, we can try to get a sense of the underlying structure of ME/CFS, really looking at how the symptoms appear in real time as recorded by real people. You guys are, living in it all the time, and that's reflected in this matrix. And so I have one of these, this is the master matrix. I also have one of these for every individual, all 27 of the participants who gave me data. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the specific structure of your symptoms and maybe your illness, we can definitely send you that data whenever you want it. And so I think I'm already over my 1-minute mark, but this is just the first of what will hopefully be many, many interesting sort of quantitative analyses that are coming out of the data team's work. So, watch this space.
All right. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
Yep. All right. I'd actually need to give you a minute. I thought I had a couple minutes with the questions. I need to pull up my data here.
Oh, if you want to take a question for a few minutes,
yeah.
that's fine too.
So, so this is the master matrix, and it's sort of a representation of the things that are common to everybody. And so one of the things that, I'm looking at is, how do individuals kind of load onto this matrix, to use sort of the technical terminology. And then since we also have data about like who's taking what medications, who's taking what supplements, it might be interesting to see like, okay, if you load really highly onto this like SIBO-like cluster, maybe you will respond better to microbiome based interventions versus if you load really highly onto this brain fog, head pressure, cognitive wall cluster, maybe you're more in the mechanical basis, kind of space. And
There we go. All right. Can everybody see the slide?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Apologies for it being so incredibly text heavy. We were limited to one slide. It is helpful to look at this as categories rather than trying to necessarily read every single detail at this point. And this is posted already in the R50, and I can always repost it so that it is easy to find. So we have a lot of overlap here. So glutamate has been implicated in ME/CFS and related diseases, and this was very important for me for more than 30 years. There has been significant ongoing research on this, just not a whole lot has been done with it. Because focus has been primarily on the effects of excess intersynaptic glutamate. So basically what we call excitotoxicity, which can then cause cell death. While excitotoxicity does drive many familiar symptoms, the sort of nerve electricity, the jumpiness, a lot of the sensory issues, the sensory sensitivity, there is also significant evidence that glutamate hypometabolism is behind core symptoms, including, importantly, PEM. In addition to its role as a neurotransmitter, which was actually very controversial for quite a long time, glutamate is a key regulator of metabolic and immune functions, which of course we know that we're dealing with a lot of issues with. And it's a direct source of fuel for the brain, also important. However, all of these functions, whether it is the metabolic or the immune or the fuel, require glutamate uptake. So particularly into the glial brain cells. All of the listed diseases have featured similar patterns of glutamate dysregulation. In particular, inversion of the glutamate to glutamine ratio is very, very common. This inversion is a direct indication of glutamate hypometabolism. It means that glutamate is not being taken up into the cell, and therefore it cannot be converted into glutamine because most of that conversion is done within the cell itself. More recently, aspartate has been shown to be similarly dysregulated in ME/CFS and long COVID. This is also further evidence of glutamate hypometabolism. It might not be the first place we go, but for me, it indicates dysfunction of the glutamate aspartate transporter, especially when we see it paired with this inversion of glutamate and glutamine. GLAST, that glutamate aspartate transporter, regulates key functions such as gut motility, lymphatic flow, joint remodeling, cardiac health. However, on its own, it does very little to reduce excitotoxicity. However, many of the treatments that have had most success affect GLAST rather than just the other transporters that would reduce excitotoxicity. So this is one of the reasons that I have been looking significantly at hypometabolism, so the lack of uptake, the lack of conversion within the cell, rather than simply stopping what I think of as like we think of it as a neurotransmitter bleed of the excitotoxicity, right? Sometimes we're bleeding out and we have to stop that, right? We have to stop that excitotoxicity, but that's not going to necessarily fix the underlying issues. And that has been fairly consistently coming back to this issue of hypometabolism. Now, where that system is dysfunctional in each of us has been a little bit different. So looking at different labs, whether it's a cross disorder or even within our cohort, there have been some minor differences, but all show some form of dysregulation of that particular metabolism. And then also shown here on the screen, all these various treatments also affect metabolism specifically, not just excitotoxicity. And if we look at all of the triggers, including, and this was another one that was important for me, traumatic brain injuries. So brainstem injuries, brainstem compression as well, can also cause the exact same thing that we see with hypometabolism of glutamate within COVID or other virus within mold, within bacterial infections. It is across the board. All right. Do we have questions?
I just got a little bit distracted again. But I didn't quite hear if you made the connection between Jeff's work and
Yes.
glutamate. Okay.
Yes. So one of the things that led me to this, so there are, if I had to narrow it down, I could narrow it down to two really, really, really critical facts that led me here. One is that my symptoms, which are undeniably caused by a major concussion. Like, yes, I absolutely have other risk factors and other things that have added to my load along the way. But my core trigger was absolutely a traumatic brain injury. And my symptoms are the same as somebody with long COVID. On the surface, that seems strange. But once you start digging into these mechanisms, they overlap. Because if it's whether it's a virus, mold, bacteria, or a mechanical injury, whether that's falling on your head like I did, or whether that is compression due to other issues, all of that will also shut down glutamate metabolism. And then we get all of the symptoms that we're used to in terms of the low energy, the lack of being able to repair body systems, the low recovery. All of that can come from that glutamate hypometabolism, and glutamate hypometabolism can be caused by either chemical or physical means.
Work. Thomas?
Yeah, so I've already seen this, and it's nice to see it again. I'm putting on my neuroscientist hat. One thing that seems conspicuously absent here is epilepsy. When I think about excessive glutamatergic activity, seizure, like lowered seizure threshold is one of like the things that everybody learns in like, psychopharmacology. And I don't see that here, and I don't think of epilepsy as being typically comorbid with
It's
post-viral illnesses. So there seems like there's a gap here that
Yes.
is crying
Oh,
out to be explained.
I got the important one out of the TBI. The other important one was the difference in response between amoxiclav and straight amoxicillin. That difference being glassed. Sorry, I left that out. But yes, epilepsy, fantastic. You'll also notice right down at the bottom the risks for hypometabolism. So there are a lot of genetic risks. And we know that we have a high prevalence of ADHD, autism, EDS, right? Those are very common and understood. What we don't have is a statistical increase in OCD or epilepsy, both of which involve glutamate. But both of those specifically involve errors of glutamate signaling. So they are more related to the excitotoxicity model, and they tend to have much less on the hypometabolism model. So in most models of epilepsy, of course, there are different types, but in most models, the metabolism is fine. The uptake is fine. The conversion is fine. In fact, there might be too much. It might be rotating too fast through, glutamate, glutamine, glutathione, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you end up with over signaling on the neurons rather than a lack of uptake into the glia.
And you
Interesting.
definitely,
Okay,
with TBI, you definitely get, or with traumatic head injury, you definitely, seizures co-linger with it and can get less as time goes on after the acute event.
It's been interesting, though, because despite the fact that seizures and traumatic brain injuries are comorbid, right? There is a huge overlap, especially for those of us who have long-term, what is called post-concussion. So not just like the immediate recovery, but the long-term symptoms. But we don't see that same, statistical lineup within ME/CFS that have had brain injuries contribute to their illness. There's a disconnect in the amount of people that, should with any concussion cohort show signs of some form of epilepsy, and those who show ME/CFS. They seem to be different cohorts. I mean, obviously there's going to be overlaps, bodies are complicated. But the numbers are suggestive that the core mechanism behind each while they may have overlaps, aren't going to be the same.
And it could be, I mean, so you're right here talking about hypometabolism.
Yeah.
As you said before, there's nothing to say it's not hyper or unregulated metabolism, essentially ongoing high energy static, which ultimately will deplete and burn out production.
Yeah.
But it's a different process.
It is. And most of the labs that we've seen, at least once people enter the chronic stage, and that's where things get a little bit weird too, is whether we're talking about, you know, virus or TBI or anything else, the sort of acute injury stage definitely looks very, very different than when it becomes chronic. And that's one of the main differences, is in the acute stage, we tend to see hypermetabolism. We tend to see, you know, a lot being uptake, a lot being converted, and a lot being used. And then we get the burnout. And that happens even on the transporter level. So GLT-1, which is considered like the main transporter for glutamate, it's responsible for regulating glutamate in the synaptic cleft to make sure that we don't get excitotoxicity. It is one of the things that responds when you get that cell danger signal. So when you have some sort of event, whether it's viral, mechanical, or otherwise, it's one of the things that says, okay, I got to do the cleanup in this emergency situation. But if that cleanup is too difficult, then it gets burned out and then it shuts down. And then we no longer have that metabolic cycle continuing.
Okay.
Sorry, they remuted me. Yeah, so GLAST is the smaller transporter for glutamate. But it's the one that I think is much more important for us, and for two reasons. One is just looking at, you know, the treatments that have been successful, more of them do tend to affect GLAST. The other reason is that most of the functions of GLAST, thank you, are ones that line up with our symptoms. So things like lymphatic system, gut motility, even joint remodeling is all involved with GLAST, more so than any of the other transporters.
So the kind of comment I was going to be bringing up had to do with how you were talking about, like, why don't we see this? And people, like, not everybody with TBI ends up with this. Not everybody with and I've gotten a concept about why that happens, and it's actually also correlates with both Jeff and what Thomas were talking about too.
Yeah.
And it has to do with learning disorders. And a lot of learning disorders are based early on about how you are networking certain aspects of your brain. And there's actually overlap with hypermobility and the formation of learning disorders, that actually, because activating certain particular pathways, like especially like dyspraxia and that, are also tied with certain language areas. And the reason why we have the language concepts in that we do that are different than other animals has to do with how we are networking these things and using them for multiple things, like fine motor tool activity is also related, it's the same area that you're using syntax and aspects of grammar, some a little bit of grammar. So practicing like fine motor tool usage with like using a tweezers and things like that could actually help you like with your syntax formation. And so you have all of these areas that have to network together. And if we have possible like hypometabolism of glutamate or various issues with that, it may lead to the possibility of a learning disorder, which may be subclinical. Or you know, just otherwise, maybe everybody in your family has it, so nobody gets diagnosed. But you end up then with this vulnerability that you may not be aware of having. And we've seen that with like long COVID, having ADHD is actually a risk factor. Having autism is a risk factor. Also, autism is connected to having higher risk of seizure possibility. So that is a there's a lot of overlaps in there that I feel like this kind of like brings it together. Like the idea of hypermobility would lead to the risk of high structural issues. And so that it's one of those, it's kind of like my argument, and I've talked to a few people about it. If we could actually do effective screening at an earlier age, like say preschool, kindergarten level, we actually might be able to help people like actually network these things before their learning disorder actually starts to impact education. But we'd also be able to help pick up people who may have POTS, other aspects of dysautonomia, and also who may be more vulnerable to these chronic issues. And I run across that with a lot of students in my like psych classes when we talk about like language formation and other things. And I'll bring up things like POTS, and I'll mention something about, it's not normal to get dizzy in the shower. And most everybody in the class like nods their head. Yeah. And then there's always one or two that are like, it's not. And because everybody in their family does that. And they don't realize this is a risk. But then as we're talking to them, or as I'm talking to them about various things, I do mention things about, there's things you can do to help stabilize yourself. Like, maybe roller coasters may not be a good idea for you if you're hypermobile, because then you could, like, do you always get a headache after a roller coaster? Or like, oh, I hate roller coasters, I don't know why people like them. It's like, hey, guess what? You might have this. And these are actually, so things like learning about like how to stabilize your neck or your head, so that way you don't run into these issues. Maybe high impact sports may not be good for you. These kind of things could drastically help kids at an earlier age to help prevent some of these issues. But I feel like this could actually, the idea of these things, that it has to do with some of the way our brains wire. And then when we have dysfunctions later on, we have these wired to an extent, but we start to lose aspects of being able to use those. So like the word recall or some of the brain fog. So people who didn't necessarily have ADHD symptoms before are now actually developing significant ADHD symptoms with like long COVID and that, because maybe they were subclinical, and maybe they just, it's just now this is no longer something that they're able to compensate for. So
there's coping mechanisms are no longer good enough. Yeah, it's stacked risk. And that goes both for, the development of ME/CFS and for the development of, let's say, clinical ADHD, right? Where it becomes so symptomatic that it is life altering, that there needs to be treatment, that no matter what your lifestyle is, there is no getting around it. And it happens with both. It's not the only early risk factor. I mean, there's a lot of other metabolic disorders, even when ADHD and et cetera don't seem to be present. And again, I say seem because we never know. As we saw early on, we thought that only like about a third of us had EDS, and then it turned into maybe more like 3/4. I have a feeling, we're going to see similar things, with ADHD and with other metabolic disorders. But yeah, so anything that we have that impairs that system in any way or alters that system in any way becomes then a risk factor. So when we do have a viral infection, we do have a high mycotoxin load, we do have a TBI, we're more likely to hit that overload and shut down. So again, thinking about when we have the acute infection or the acute injury, and, our body is trying to clean up that mess, and we get this big overload, well, can we then come back from it? And that's really, that last piece is what seems to then push us over into ME/CFS if we can't come back to a normal state.
So that raises an interesting question that, I've been wondering about a lot, especially because my partner is ADHD. Are there glutamatergic prophylactics that maybe you should be taking now, like Rutin or something, to try to,
Okay, so yeah, here's the other thing. I guess I should probably mention, because mostly what gets sort of advertised and broadcast, and what you hear at the psychiatrist is ADHD. It's all about chasing that dopamine, right? It's all about needing to feel good, and of course that makes us feel bad, because like, oh well, if we just did our work, it'd be fine and we wouldn't be ADHD. No, it's not how it works. The strongest genetic ties for ADHD and autism are all involved in glutamate metabolism within glial cells. Like, just way, way beyond any of the dopamine tie-ins. Now, those systems interregulate. Our bodies are not a bunch of silos. They all interregulate. So anytime there's disorder in one system, it's going to affect one of the others. But yes, ADHD at its basis is a form of glutamate hypometabolism. It's just one that's not so severe, and one that tends to come with, some fun other side effects. Some literally fun, some sarcastically fun. But yeah, there are a lot of things. I have kind of wondered about the number of people who were diagnosed post-injury, post-COVID, whatever it was. And yes, some of it is simply the fact that it is the stacked risk, right? But I also wonder if that kind of goes the other way. Is that, what about those people who were diagnosed early and were treated early? that had, whatever it was, in medication, diet, routine, whatever, that actually supported their system. What I wonder is if they are less likely to then go into ME/CFS, or maybe even less likely to go into, that really, really acute sickness response.
Well, since most ADHD sort of standard treatments are dopaminergic, not glutamatergic,
Oh, that's what they said. Guess what? So all amphetamines and Wellbutrin all really strongly affect glutamate metabolism. Ritalin much less so. So there are some differences there. But yeah, a lot of the things that are used to medicate ADHD, both clinically and, a lot of the stuff that we get, from, nootropics or wherever, what's on the label is all about dopamine. But if you actually dig into the effects, there's almost always glutamate effects as well, usually fairly strong ones.
Are they consistent glutamate effects?
They are not. And
Okay,
that's where the
interesting.
clues are.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And it also comes down to activating different areas of the brain that are also
Yeah.
like default mode network versus and
Which
things like that. That and
default
then
mode
some of your-
network is controlled by glutamate directly.
Yeah.
It's what turns
So-
it on and off.
And then also like some of your emotional systems, like your grief system. And it's sometimes you're actually trying to activate using dopamine and glutamate, some more of like action pathways. So that's your focus and thought. So you may actually catch yourself either completely focused and on a task and that kind of thing, or shut down and I can't initiate anything. So it's basically your reward system and your non-reward system. And those can be mediated by aspects of glutamate, but dopamine's still a big player in it. And so you may actually be using dopamine to basically any dopamine you're actually getting from the reward system. And that may actually be more plastering over the actual symptomology rather than actually treating it. And it's just allowing you to not feel it and to be functional for a short period of time, not necessarily, but you could still have the sickness behavior. It looks like Tess is going to stop us.
Isabel has an important meeting that she has to open with this in Healthy. So we're going to have to run.
Okay.
But I'll post, we can go to the Geeks meeting and keep talking if you want.
Okay.
All right, I'll post
I'll
in
go ahead
Slack
and
to make sure everybody knows.
So I'll end it in this so that way she can get to her meeting.
I have to go. So I have
Okay.
something to too. So it was really good to see you guys.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.